All right, here we're going to talk about how and why we can see that emotions are actually a sociological phenomenon, even though it's so tempting to assume that they are the products of human nature or something that's biologically ingrained in us. And as we heard in the Invisibility podcast, we really only experience four different kinds of sensation. So things can either be pleasant, unpleasant, they can arouse us, or they can calm us. So we have these sensations, and then we have distinct responses to them. But in the middle, we have these concepts. So these are these conceptual blocks or boxes in which we can filter or understand a sensation that we're experiencing. And based on whatever concept or whatever conceptual box we can put it in, that is going to lead to how we respond to a particular sensation. So it's not that sensation leads to automatic response. It's sensation, concepts, response. And I put this question on here of why is this a sociological theory of emotion? It's because the concepts that we use to understand these sensations, these are things that are given to us through socialization. We come to learn how to understand certain sensations in certain ways. So we respond to them based on how we've come to understand them. And one way in which we can see this is by looking at a case where we can see socialization occurring in real time.
They go too fast. No, it's not. It's going really slow. Like grandma's slow. Like a Bugatti slow. Evan, come on, you're fine. This is fun. Come on. Here we go. Hold on tight. Here we go. See, that's not that bad. That's not that bad. Oh no. There's a drop ahead of it. Oh! That was fun, huh? Yeah, here we go. Hold on tight, buddy. Hold on tight. Oh my goodness. Oh, that's awesome, huh? Come on, smile. It's fun. Look. Oh no, going up, going up. Oh. Here we go. You got this. Woo! Oh, wow.
All right, so what do we just see in that clip? Well, we see presumably a father and son on that roller coaster, right? Seems like the son is not experienced with what the roller coaster is going to do. And this is obviously a very arousing experience and very intense experience. On a roller coaster, you're being hurtled through space at high rates of speed, and it's really easy to feel that you're both aroused and then also to think that this is a very unpleasant experience. But what do we see the dad doing there? He is trying to tell his son or give him a concept through which he can understand this experience. So he keeps telling him, like, all this arousal that you're getting, this is fun, right? He says that multiple times. This is fun. And you can see when, especially when they hit the first drop, right? The kid's kind of terrified, doesn't know how to make sense of this. And what his dad doing there is trying to tell him, this is how you should understand this experience. This is the conceptual box you should put the sensation in. And then this is how you should respond to it. So you're being hurtled through space. This is fun. Therefore, you should smile. All right. Again, trying to seeing how someone is teaching someone how to understand their experience on a roller coaster might seem kind of trivial. You know, it's not a life and death situation. but it shows and speaks to the more general process in which we try to train kids, especially young kids, how to understand particular situations they're in or particular sensations they're experiencing. We tell them, put the sensation in this box, and once it's in this box, then it should have this kind of response. And so in theory, our emotions can be quite elaborate and can be quite socially diverse because different communities could understand things in different ways. And so people could have different responses to different sensations. And in theory, this also means that we could come to learn to understand particular sensations in new ways. We can have different emotional responses to things that we've experienced. And this is, I think, is an issue that the podcast speaks to, right? With the guy who had the car accident, right, where the daughter died, but then he sued the family for his emotional distress over the pain that this accident caused him, even though this is the family, he's suing the family who had lost a child. His understanding of that situation, at least his initial understanding of that situation, was filtered through a particular set of concepts, and particularly the ideas that are associated with an issue we'll speak to later this week of kind of the traditional understandings of masculinity. And because of that understanding of these emotions, he had particular responses, and it sounds like it was basically a case of, PTSD. But over time, he was able to put that experience in a new conceptual box and to learn to think about it in a new way. And it's true that we probably have the amount of mental flexibility that we could all do this. We could all work on changing how we understand particular things and have different responses to them. But I also think it's important to note that this is not just something that can happen like the flick of a switch, or you clap your hands and then things have automatically change. People have to do a lot of work to change their understanding of these sensations and then to be able to respond to them a new way. And so when people do have things like experience with PTSD, they can get to the other side of this experience where they can move beyond having those symptoms, or move beyond by say being panicked by certain things, that remind them of the situation that caused them to have PTSD in the first place. But it is a process that can take a lot of time and can take a lot of work on the part of the individual. All right. Another area we can see socialization is something you didn't read about, but I think it's worth talking about. If nothing else, there'll be some practical advice we can take from this. And this is how Leroux, a very famous sociologist who also was at the University of Maryland for a while, she did studies of family rearing practices and found that there were distinctive styles of parenting in working class and poor families, and then another distinctive style for middle class families. And she refers to these as the accomplishment of natural growth for poor and working class families, and then in contrast, what she calls concerted cultivation for middle class families. And the main idea, or the main difference between these is for working class and poor families, their understanding of child rearing is you provide kids with the basics, and then you let them go out and kind of discover who they're going to be on their own. So you make sure they're well fed, that they've got a safe place to stay, all those sorts of things. You take care of the basics, but then the process of growing up is usually left to these kids to figure out on their own terms. In contrast, middle class families engage in concerted cultivation, And here, parents feel that they need to actively control and shape the experiences that their children have in order so they can be successful in life. So if you have that, like you heard the notion of like a helicopter parent, some parent who oversees everything that a child does and provides feedback and guidance and selects which activities a kid is going to do, that is more in line with this understanding of concerted cultivation. I can say growing up, I was probably more in the accomplishment of natural growth understanding. Both my parents came from, they ended up being, my dad was a professional. He worked for a major corporation, but he grew up on a farm in rural Minnesota. And my mom grew up in a really small town in Minnesota, and her dad wasn't a farmer, but he worked at like the local dairy factory. So very much kind of farming inspired backgrounds. And so because of that, growing up, for a long time, I lived in Iowa, like basically when I was in grade school. And the idea was, we'd come home for lunch and dinner, and then we had to be in by dark. But the rest of the time was ours, and we had kind of free reign to live. Like we lived on a hill, and we had free reign of the hill, and we could do whatever we wanted. And so just me and my group of friends, we would go out, we'd go in the woods, we'd play baseball or whatever happened to be, and we would kind of just do our own thing. And then when we were hungry, we'd go home. Many of you probably grew up in more of a concerted cultivation experience where your parents really structured experiences for you in order to prepare you for future endeavors in life. All right, and here's a chart that kind of outlines some of the key differences between these two strategies. So for concerted cultivations, parents are actively fostering these experiences and trying to cultivate the talents, opinions, and skills of their children. For accomplishment, natural growth is you kind of let kids on their own and develop themselves. For organization of daily life, lots of activities. This is where parents like act as chauffeurs, driving your kid to, violin practice, then soccer, and then a tutor, and then maybe, you go somewhere where they're learning a new language, something like that. Whereas accomplishment, natural growth, most of the time the kids are spent hanging out and just doing their own thing. Language use, and this is a really key difference, and we'll touch more upon this in a second. For accomplishment of natural growth, the idea is that the basic idea is that parents give directives or orders. You do this, and then the kids are supposed to do it. So there's not a lot of opportunity for kids to question or give feedback to their parents or challenge what their parents are saying. It's kind of do what I say, go outside, go do the dishes, go make your bed, and then you're just expected to do that. In contrast with concerted cultivation, parents are much more likely to talk things out with their kids, and kids can feel free to challenge or push back against their parents' ideas, or to give explanations for why they should do something or shouldn't do something. So there's a lot of negotiation here. Then in terms of institutions and interventions in institutions, parents who are involved in concerted cultivation will take a much more active role in institutions and try to make sure that institutions are working for the benefit of their individual child. Whereas parents who employ the accomplishment of natural growth, they see themselves as more dependent on institutions and will do what institutions tell them. So if they say that your child, doesn't qualify to be part of the gifted and talented program, parents from the accomplishment of natural growth will generally accept that. They won't challenge or push back, But in concerted cultivation, they likely will. So they might hire someone like an outside evaluator, and they'll do that in order to make the case that their child should be, say, enrolled in the gifted and talented program even if they don't meet, say, the formal criteria or they're kind of on the borderline. And then the consequence of this is that kids with a concerted cultivation background have a sense of entitlement in that they think that institutions should accommodate them and their needs. Where the accomplishment of natural growth, they feel things as kind of a constraint in that institutions do things, and if they do things that you don't like or you don't agree with, too bad, you just kind of go with it. You're not going to try to actively intervene or push back against institutional decisions. And so you can think about, like in the college experience, let's say there's the students having a negative experience in one class. Well, if that student comes from a family where there is this concerted cultivation orientation, it's much more likely that either the student, him or herself, would send out an email, say to, the dean or someone in the institution, academic advising, saying that they need help to resolve the situation. Or the parents might actually intervene and say, call the professor, call the chair of the department, or call academic advising and say, things need to change in this class in order to make the experience better for my child. Whereas with the accomplishment of natural growth, students having a negative experience in a class, they're likely not to bring it up. They're likely not to push back. They're likely just to kind of go with it and deal with whatever consequences result from it. All right, and so this is one practical area where these different orientations matter and matter in some key ways. And what you're seeing here are differences in the amount of words that are addressed to children by income group or class. So this is for professional families, these are working class families, and these are for families who are on welfare. And as you can see, there are pretty significant differences in how much a child is talked to, with welfare families not talking to their children that much, working class families talking to their children more and addressing them more, and then professional children being addressed a lot more. And one area where in this gap ends up being, by the time the child's 3 or 4 years old, we're talking like tens of millions of words differences that say a difference between what a professional child could hear as opposed to the child from a family that's on welfare. And what that means is that coming into, say, preschool or kindergarten, kids from certain backgrounds have a lot more exposure to language, and essentially they have a lot more practice of using and understanding language than kids coming from some other backgrounds who can really be at a deficit. So coming in with higher linguistic abilities earlier in school can really matter and can kind of set the tone for further education. So the one practical takeaway message from this is that if you end up having kids in your life, talk to them as much as you can, especially when they're young. And it doesn't so matter what you talk to them about. Just the fact that you're talking to them gives kids practice to engage with language and can allow them to develop linguistic skills that can pay dividends throughout their life. All right, so why do these differences matter between concerted cultivation and accomplishment of natural growth? Well, they lead to different skill sets. So kids who are part of the accomplishment of natural growth strategy, they know how to manage their free time well. And so they can entertain themselves. They can invent new games and new things to do. In contrast, kids that come from this background of concerted cultivation engage in a lot of what's called anticipatory socialization, or what are essentially rehearsals for future roles that they might have when they grow up. They're basically practicing the skills that they are going to use later in life. And so because of that can have distinct advantages. And one example, and this comes from my personal background, but um, for some families who have, like, say, first generation students, so the first generation, they're part of the first generation from their family to go to a college. Understanding the college environment is a quite complex thing. There's lots of nuances that's involved here, and just being able to figure out how you navigate, an institution like Gettysburg can take some time to figure out kind of the lay of the land, how it works, what things you can ask for, what things you can't ask for. And if you don't know people that have had the experience of college and know kind of how it works in practice, and who can help you navigate this place, it's really easy to come to a place like Gettysburg and to be lost, and over time you'll probably figure out the lay of the land, but in that period in which you're lost, that could be a situation like maybe you don't do as well as your classes that you had initially anticipated, because you don't know the existence of things like the writing center and stuff like that. So not having familiarity with college prior to coming into it can put you at a disadvantage. For my son in particular, that's not going to be an issue, because ever since he can remember, we've lived in Gettysburg for a big time. The college was like an extended playground for him. We used to come in on the weekends, and then we would like basically play like teacher and student in unoccupied classrooms over the weekend. He is just going to grow up. He has grown up being very familiar with and very comfortable with a college environment. And if he chooses to go to college, that can serve him well, because he's already kind of done, on a preliminary way, some college related things, right? He's rehearsed what college is going to look like on some basic level, whereas some other kids might come in and not have that background, and because of that, they could potentially be at a disadvantage. And the final point that Leroy wants to make is that neither one of these strategies is inherently better than the other. They both work. They can both produce happy kids. But given today's current environment, kids that come from the background with concerted cultivation, the skills that they developed, reasoning skills, debate skills, those kinds of things, linguistic skills, are much more in line with the other dominant social institutions, that in the current circumstance, it does have advantages. So it's not inherently better than the accomplishment of natural growth, but in the current state of affairs, it is an advantage to come from this kind of background. All right, in the last part of the lecture, we'll talk about the different stages of socialization.